You just get into certain magical projects through your collaboration with the spirits. It doesn't need a name. Spirits don't do Goetia, spirits don't do Solomonic magic. These are all human interfaces that we've put on top of it.
Salutations, listeners, and welcome back to Glitch Bottle, the podcast where we uncork the uncommon in magic, mysticism, and the generally misunderstood. I'm Alexander Eth, and today we are so excited to welcome to the podcast experienced magician and author, Frater Acker. Frater Acker is a lone practitioner of the magical and mystical path. Since 2009, he's been the author of theomagica.com, where he shares wonderful, in-depth magical blog posts, essays, and other invaluable resources. In 2020, Frater Acker founded Para Librum, an online site that offers in-depth, independent reviews of bibliophile culture together with Frater UD. And Frater Acker continues to be an active collaborator of Quaria Magical Training, which I know many listeners will be familiar with from previous guest Josephine McCarthy. Now, Frater Acker holds an MA in Communications Science, Intercultural Communications, and Psychology, as well as certifications in Systemic Coaching and Gestalt Therapy. He has studied Western ritual magic in theory and practice at Imbolc, and has been actively involved in magic for more than 20 years. Frater Acker is a German national, and after several years of living abroad, he is now a resident in Munich, Germany. He's written several books that many listeners are familiar with, including Cyprian of Antioch, The Mage of Many Faces, Holy Diamond, Black Abbot, White Magic, Johannes Trithemius and the Angelic Mind, and many more. In this episode, we're so excited to chat with Frater Acker about the latest book from Hadean Press, Clavis Goêtica, Keys to Chthonic Sorcery by Frater Acker and Jose Gabriel Alegria Sabogal. This tome is wonderful and gets to the heart of what goetia or goetia is by tracing the history of the term and its practitioners, connecting the dots to magicians throughout the centuries, by sharing personal experiences on what a ritual involves, and the book concludes with detailed tactical instructions focusing on the tradition of divining skulls or teraphim. Frater Acker shares about all of these topics. He also answers your wonderful Glitch Bottle Patreon listener questions, and thanks so much to each and every patron for your support, and so much more. Also, a huge thanks to Frater Acker for his generosity of spirit with setting up a time to record this chat. And now to help us uncork the uncommon, let's welcome Frater Acker. Frater Acker, thank you so much for coming on the Glitch Bottle podcast today.
Thank you, Alex. Pleasure to be here.
Well, the honor is certainly mine, Frater, and I know the listeners have been looking very much forward to your stopping by as much as I have. And I first heard of your work, Frater, from the great Josephine McCarthy, who I know many listeners are familiar with. And for those listeners who might be hearing your work for the first time or hearing about you for the first time, could you maybe share a little bit about your background? How did you first come into contact with and become immersed in the occult?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I love listening to other authors' answers or practitioners' answers to that, because it gives you kind of a little background and history and their access to the craft. When I listened to other people answering that question, it really dawned on me that magic is always there. We kind of dip in and out of it, as we kind of incarnate, do our stint here, and then we die again, and then we incarnate again. So magic is always there. The question is, when you're born and you come out as a little girl, little boy, how long does it take you to tune your senses, to tune your heart into actually being able to interact with it, to realize it, to be, as you said, in contact with it. It's not at all about creating magic. It doesn't really take any creative act on the side of the magician. It just takes an act of shutting up and, listening carefully, and then probably working on your numb senses to become sufficiently aware of it. So to me, I think that was probably, when I was 14 or so, and I think I said this elsewhere, I began to read the novels of Gustav Meyrink, and they just really lit that awareness for me of my own path and where I needed to go with this. And then about 10 years followed of very, very in-depth research as a very young boy, and I read a lot of books that I was entirely unqualified for to read or even understand, but I kind of sharpened my mental saw on these books for too many years, actually, until I got in touch with Imbolc and Agrippa, who runs Imbolc. And that's really in 2001 where my practical path then started. And then I did about 10 years with Imbolc, a lot of practical work, a lot of theoretical work. And as I got to the end of my time at Imbolc, that's when Josephine and I met and began to chat and got into different chapters and new pieces of work. So in essence, I think that kind of gives you a very rough overview of where I've come from.
Yeah, that is so fascinating. And I think, Frater, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think I remember hearing elsewhere that before you even did your first ritual, for example, I think you studied as part of your training for like 3 years just to kind of prepare yourself for that. Can you share a little bit more about that and about going through this training, but then also being a solo practitioner?
Yeah, I think that these are two questions. Happy to expand on these. So my entry into the practical arena of magic really was through Imbolc. And Imbolc really is Agrippa, the founder of it. And just like many others, I joined his distance learning study course. I'm lucky enough to live relatively close to where he lives, so I could shoot over and see him, once a month or so. But in effect, it was a distance learning study course. And many people who started think, okay, like, let's do some magic. Let's wear a rope, let's get out into the woods and do something dangerous. And that is totally not what's happening when you start this. Agrippa actually has another education in the military in lone combat. And so he's very well trained to disappoint foolish expectations. And so he basically just made me shut up, sit down, and do all the practical necessary work to lay the foundation so that you're even qualified to be in a ritual setting. So for some people, they might be much faster than I was, and that might be a much shorter time. But for me, that was about 2 years, possibly 3 years, not only until I had sharpened my senses, tamed my bodily senses enough to quiet and really become still so that I could begin to work on a spirit level, but then also to just build out a temple. That's part of what you do at Imbolc. You do everything yourself. You craft everything. So it takes a while until not only you as a tool have become ready, but you've also assembled all the other tools that you need. So these first 3 years were hugely exciting and interesting. And I think also really essential in breaking down this misperception that magic only starts when you're in a ritual circle. But it took definitely a while. It didn't happen overnight.
This book, Clavis, Goêtica, you talk about in the introduction, and actually Jake Stratton Kent writes the foreword to your book. Can you share a little bit about the relationship, Frater, that your book, the Clavis, Goêtica, has with the earlier works of Jake Stratton Kent to kind of break down some of the misunderstandings and historical misinterpretations in the past about the Goetic tradition?
Yeah, happy to do that. So Jake's work, I think, in this field is really, really essential. There are other authors who paved the path equally, but I don't think anybody created a ripple like his work really did. And what I found so revealing in reading his books is that his approach to magic really comes from an animistic background. It's like the lived experience, the proximity to the spirits that he holds. And then with all the research that he has done into the ancient Greek times, I think what he was able to do is to help people see that a lot of this tradition is based upon a mythological landscape. That means a mental landscape that guides you through certain spirit contacts that is real and alive and encapsulated in certain myths or in certain spirit traditions. But what matters is the living reality behind it. The myth is man-made. The myth is just an access point for people to interact with it. And traditionally before that, I feel a lot of the interactions with grimoires had not understood this mythical context, and they had taken all these spirit names oftentimes out of context and more tried to treat it like a science. Like, okay, if I flip this switch, then this needs to happen. My personal 2 cents are that nature doesn't do well. Nature doesn't like if you treat it like a science. Science is embedded into nature, but nature is so much more than it. So I think this mythological landscape, this living reality behind this tradition of Goetic rituals, he was really the one, at least for me, who kind of pulled down that veil. I think from an anthropological language, you would probably say that JSK adopted the amic perspective. He really kind of went native with the spirits and then spoke back to us from a spirit's point of view.
Your book, building on that theme that you just touched on, you mentioned starts with a foundation in history of Goetia and what it is. And then it moves on to accounts of modern practitioners, which we'll discuss. And it also concludes with a very detailed instruction from several different sources on the tradition of divining skulls or teraphim. And you say that this book is, quote, quintessentially shamanic. Could you maybe elaborate on that? Because I love that phrase. It's so great.
Yeah, happy to. I'm very conscious that the term shamanic, it doesn't have an background of orthopraxy or orthodoxy. It's a very free-floating term, and people kind of make of it whatever they want to. And that's fine. To a certain degree, I'm probably using it in this way myself. So I'll happy to explain what I mean with it. To me, the shamanic worldview, actually, when you look back over the last centuries, it's a lot of what we've lost in the Western European tradition. And instead, what we held onto was an entirely formalized, structured, ritualized, very male-dominated approach to magic. Whereas the shamanic approach, from what I know about it and how I'm practicing it, doesn't need all this structure, all this man-made overlay. It kind of goes to where the spirits live rather than drawing the spirits to where we live. Probably the most important distinction for me, when you work through a shamanic lens, you always consider yourself part of an ecosystem. So no notion of human dominion or supremacy can exist when you work as part of a living spirit ecosystem. I would actually compare it to a lot of the activism that happens right now on the environmental side, where a lot of people propagate that, we just need to blend in and we need to learn again what it means to blend in and give up all these ideas of humans being the gardeners in the Garden of Eden. No, we're just one other plant, and we've overtaken way too much of that garden. So the same is true for magic. We're just one other spirit. And how do we now work in partnership with these other spirits? If you compare it to a human body, the blood system is no more important than the lymph system, than the hormonal system. The whole can only exist, thrive, and grow if really each component is playing its part. So if I need to boil this down, what a shamanic way of working to me means is that you speak to the spirits, you respect them, and you ask them, tell me what you're doing. Let me tell you what I'm about to do, and then we'll find out whether we can do something together. It does not at all mean that you have a naive assumption that there couldn't be dangerous spirits, that there couldn't be spirits that, you don't just walk up to and talk to them. That's totally not what it means. But in principle, you only walk to the places where the dangerous spirits aren't around and where you can have contact to spirits like you would do with human beings. It's no different, really.
Tell me if I'm getting this correct. When you look at something that can be very complex, like the Clavicula Salomonis, the Key of Solomon, for example, there's incense and planetary hours and days and confessions, or Liber Juratus, where it's incredibly complex, and there's a Roman Catholic overlay that had been in place for hundreds of years. What you're saying, Frater, is in your direct experience and your direct engagements with the spirits, it's a lot less complicated and a lot less involved in terms of having this kind of architectural, historical Christian overlay applied onto it. Would that be somewhat fair?
Yes. Well, maybe it can help with kind of transporting this into another realm, and that might make it a little bit more clear. So a lot of these texts come from late medieval times. Let's just kind of look at other late medieval texts. If you have people traveling across Europe, into Asia, into China, into Japan, and then back during these times when you read accounts of how Europeans went into Latin America during that time, etc., their tone of voice, the way they will tell these stories, is the tone of voice of medieval person or late medieval person, oftentimes very much colored through a Christian background. So if you read an account of, let's say, a Catholic priest going to Latin America and describing you exactly kind of what, he thinks all these tribes are doing and, how incredibly dangerous and wild and archaic they are, there might be nuggets of truth in what that person is describing. It might not all be rubbish, but certainly you're probably learning more about them as a human being, their own perspective, then you're actually learning about that tribe at that time. So it's not sufficient to just follow these historic descriptions. They're good milestones. They do offer something, but you can't get around your own research. This really, I think, the parallels between anthropology and magic through a lived experience, a shamanic experience, are still completely underestimated. The voice of the anthropologist too often colors the description of what they actually saw, the tribes that they interacted with. So you need to get firsthand knowledge yourself. You need to become an anthropologist yourself. You need to do field work. Now, that field work can be dangerous, and you don't just kind of walk out and, be unprepared. So the question is not, were the late medieval grimoires right or wrong? The question is, how can these books help me to get thoroughly prepared for my own field research? And that's a very personal question. My answer might not be your answer, and that's perfectly fine.
You mentioned that the ancient term of the goes, the grave dweller and skull speaker, quickly became replaced with the fashionable Persian loanword of the mage. Could you please give us an overview of what goetia means and why the Persian word, the loanword for mage, was used instead? Because that is just fascinating, and I think goes right to your point about bias and historical reasons for kind of switching out some of the names.
Yeah, happy to explain. And there's a wonderful article that I quote from in the book from Walter Burkhardt that actually explains this in much detail. So feel free to go back to that original source. I think the article is in German, but it's fantastic. So I won't go into the detail of what goes or goetia means. You can read that up in the book, but it's very fair to say that it used to be a very archaic, old term to reference certain kinds of magic, sorcery that totally were related to the realm of the underworld, the dead, to burial rites, etc. Jake Stratton-Kent, gives a great account of that in his books as well. So I won't repeat that. But it's very interesting, your question, why did this then get replaced with the word of the mage or the mages? You can only understand that really if you understand the history of when that happened. And this kind of exchange of words, if you want, happened more or less in the 6th century before our time. And that was exactly the time in ancient Greek when democracy, as we know it, first formed as an experiment. That was a pretty radical new idea that, everybody had a say and we all need to come together. The idea of the Greek term, the polis, the people that are coming together in this, was absolutely essential. When you try to understand what democracy really is, then one of the underpinning essential premises that you need for democracy is everybody needs to go and vote. Everybody needs to be in and express their voice. Otherwise, you fragment and then it doesn't work. Different in an autocracy, or if you have a king, you just need everybody to obey. But in this situation with democracy, everybody needs to be in. You need to have a coherent community of people who are leaning in. Now, obviously, in ancient Greek, this happened in much, much smaller terms than what we're thinking of today with millions of people. That was not at all their reality. Here we're talking about city-states or cities, much smaller numbers, but it was also a different time. And this is where the relation to the goes come in. The goes, by definition, was a solitary practitioner. The goes, by definition, was separate from the religious state cults. And so by definition, you could say that the Goes undermined the social coherence because they did not weave in, they did not blend into this community, but they stood in the periphery of it, offering sometimes their services, offering access to the divine that really undermined a lot of this state-driven idea of coming together. And so that's why the Go is essentially, like other functions as well at the time, it was a threat to this experiment that they were undertaking. That is one of the aspects of why over time the term Goes became more and more a swear word, and it was replaced with the Iranian loan word of the mage. And the mage was then a word that was much more tuned into the state cult, into astrology, into what today we would probably call celestial magic. But really, underneath that, you find political motivation, as so often in human history.
There are people out there, Frater, to your exact point, who might define themselves as esotericists based on the kind of grimoire they practice from. So I am someone who practices, the Key of Solomon, or I am someone who practices the Heptameron, et cetera, et cetera. But you mention in the book, Frater, that, quote, we can see that the definition of a Goes is much more aimed at a state of being rather than a particular practice, unquote. Can you just elaborate on that? Because that might surprise some people who, at least in today's day and age, might define themselves based on the practice instead.
That's a good point. I think there's so much that hangs on this question of identity today. So many facets of our modern life, are charged with questions of identity. It's a shame, really, because, again, from a shamanic point of view, how we identify and as what we identify, it actually doesn't matter that much. It matters to us, but it doesn't really matter that much to the beings around us. If you imagine you have a tree out there in a garden and the tree is so, wrestling with their own identity and, should I be called this Latin name or should I be called that Latin name? It kind of really doesn't matter to the other trees. What matters is, does the tree do its job? What is the tree actually there for? What's its purpose? I think, at least for myself, I'm looking through the same lens. It kind of doesn't matter which tools you're using. It doesn't matter which book you've been reading recently. The question is, what are you going to do with it? So when you are in touch with these spirits, whether they're Goetic or whether they're celestial or wherever from, it doesn't matter. What are you going to do? Why you're practicing actually magic? I do think there's one really obvious misunderstanding, especially as it comes to Goetic literature. There's often this false dichotomy portrayed that either people are trying to control and coerce spirits, or you mingle with them or you submit to them. It's kind of this false polarity of control versus intimacy. Do you lock them up or do you get into bed with them? And both attitudes to me speak to a lack of experience and lack of skill. Imagine you walk the streets in a city that you don't know, far away. If you had that mindset, okay, am I going to control all of these people here, walk around with the gun and coerce them to do stuff? Or do I just invite them all up to my room and go into bed with them? These are both extremes of contact. The much more useful question would be, have you learned how these people say hello to each other and how they greet each other? Do you understand the cultural code with how they interact? Do you understand what kind of behavior will get you into trouble with these beings and what kind of behavior will not? Again, I think the books that you've read, the tools that you're using, all of that is super helpful. But the real question is, have you begun to understand the code and the rules and the culture that you're really beginning to immerse yourself in? Because this is a non-human culture. It's very difficult to understand these things. You need to become free of your own human biases to begin to think like some of these spirits do. It takes a lifetime to adopt that perspective.
I really hope the listeners appreciate that as much as I do, Frater. It's such a beautiful and needed reminder to kind of slash through some of those mischaracterizations. And in the book, you share a deeply personal experience and an excerpt of one of your early Goetic workings from the year 2012. And of course, readers, I definitely encourage you to pick up a copy of Frater's book to read the entire excerpt. One thing that struck me, Frater, was the importance of solitary effort and making direct offerings to befriend the beings inhabiting a place before any other work is done. Can you share a little bit about that in terms of your experience overall? And what would you like listeners to keep in mind?
Yeah, I hope I don't repeat myself, but especially if you work outside in nature, you're part of an ecosystem. That means wherever you go, there are spirits living. Like, it's very, very rare to come across a place where, there's no spirit inhabitants in that location. So you're the guest, or maybe you're the intruder. You're certainly the person who just happens to show up while other stuff is going on in this place. So before you do any kind of stuff, it doesn't matter what, you just need to shut up, listen, and understand, if I wasn't around right now, what would be going on in this place? Who's here? Who's living here? Who's having breakfast here? How's this place being used by the spirits normally? And then in most cases, certainly when you work in significant places that, even through the spirit's lens have meaning, you probably will want to ask for permission to work in that space. Imagine someone coming into your house, not realizing that this is actually your house, and just kind of rolling out their chalk circle on your ground, saying, yeah, everybody shut up here now, I need to do my ritual, right? Maybe if that person really explained their motives to you, and actually if you developed a relationship of trust to that person, maybe you would allow them to do their ritual in your living room. It's still a long shot, but there might be a possibility. And this is how I think we need to treat the realm of the spirits. We show up in it, we're part of it. And in order for this to work really well, it's a matter of collaboration. It's a matter of spirit to human collaboration to making this work.
To that point, Frater, in the book, you also talk about the mother and this raw, undiluted power of those wishing to practice true goetia. And you contrast that power of the mother with this kind of masculine, misdirected energy that, quote, there was a, quote, male goetic revolt for boundless freedom coupled with full empowerment by the fertile force of nature that continued to poison the heart of Western magic, unquote. Can you just kind of sketch out for listeners the interplay between the mother or the great mother and this masculine, misdirected force, if you will?
Yeah. This is a complex one. I encourage people to read the chapter in the book, and I was trying to give as many footnotes and references as possible. So hopefully that is helpful in the bibliography as well. But let me try to explain this. Just forget the term mother and forget the term sons or offspring of the mothers. Just take natural forces as such. The more raw and uncontrolled and direct your exposure to the essence of a natural force, the lower your ability to remain active, in control, and to coordinate whatever actions follows. If you stand in the middle of a tornado, of a storm, you're probably, even if you attempt to be active and in control, you're going to be pretty passive and you're going to be slapped around, thrown around, and that's it. Now, the lower the rawness, the more controlled and confined the natural force that you're interacting with, the more you as a human being can do stuff with it. The more it becomes a power that you can direct, control, and interact with. And this is really what we're seeing in many of the myth when we go back to ancient Greece. And this is no different, this myth of the Dactyls and the mother. The mother represents very, very ancient and raw spirit forces that do have consciousness. You can interact with them, but it's very difficult to do that and to have and hold on to your own agenda. Normally, when you interact with forces like that, you kind of have to submit to their power. It's like being thrown out into an ocean. You can try to tell the ocean what to do, but it's probably not going to happen. If you take a glass of water, you can direct what you will do with that glass of water. So what we're often seeing in these myths is that as humans learned how to interact with these spirit forces, they found ways to chop these raw forces up into smaller and smaller containers of power that they can then control and work with. Now, this process of chopping up, it's not bad, it's not good, it just is. It's a mechanic, it's a technique that nature allows us to interact with. If you chop something out of, this big natural force, it will still have its own spirit. You can still interact with it as in spirit. Like your glass of water is spirited, just like the ocean is. It's just different. So that's what we're seeing. And when you look at this particular myth, what happened to be the case, again, I don't have an opinion on it. It just happened, is the male forces had a tendency to be the ones who really liked chopping natural forces up and containing them to small containers that were practically to direct around. That was oftentimes what you find when male characters come around. And oftentimes when you have ancient female characters come around, they show you the opposite. They break up all these little vessels and they combine them and, they get you back to the original raw forces. This is a polarity with kind of many, many milestones from one end to the other that we as magicians need to learn to interact with. But the essential rule is the more raw and ancient the force that you're working with, the less the control that you will have, the less of an ability for you as a magician to bring your own agenda.
That ties into one of the 3 tips that you sketch out in the book, Frater, for readers. You say in the book that one learns from the spirits, not books. Among those tips are something you just touched on, which is embracing the direct otherness of the spirits face to face without magical protective cushioning. You talk about also training our spirit to remain coherent when liberated from physical senses. And the third tip you mention that I'd just like to touch on here quickly is going into nature. And I found this so fascinating because you mentioned that, quote, for over more than a decade now, I've been actively working as a goes in the mountain caves in the Northern Alps, unquote. How did you first come across the mountain caves in the Northern Alps? And how did you know it was a really good fit to practice there?
Yeah. Actually, I had much more material, or still have much more material written down from these magical workings over the last 10 years or so. And I had planned a much bigger chapter on them in the book, but then it became very apparent from the spirit side that they did not like me putting that in. So I needed to take this out. And what remained in is a much smaller portion of what was originally planned. The funny thing is, Alex, I've been doing this work off and on for 10 years, much of it together with a magical friend. I never considered it goetia. I never considered it that I was actually working as a goes. And only when I began to write this book and really research the concept, the words, the terminology, especially when I encountered this mother figure in the original myth, it kind of dawned on me, well, holy shit, this is kind of the work that I've been doing. This is exactly what happened to me in the cave, etc. So it was interesting. And maybe this is helpful as an answer to the question that you asked earlier, people who over-identify with the books that they might be practicing. The book is actually quite meaningless. The book is just an access point. What matters is what you do with it. And so I think my experience might be quite common, that you just get into certain magical projects through your collaboration with the spirits. It doesn't need a name. Spirits don't do goetia. Spirits don't do Solomonic magic. These are all human interfaces that we've put on top of it. But to answer your question, I got into this work in the cave through magical work that I can't talk about. At one point of that journey, it just became very apparent that I needed to work in a cave at the foot of a mountain. I had read a few mentions of that cave, because obviously it's very, very old, and there have been a few reports of it on the internet, but it's very hidden. It's not easy to find. So I just had a rough location of where it probably would be. I drove there. It's about 2 hours ride from where I live. And sometimes naivety in magic is your downfall. And sometimes actually it's a key that works really well. So I just parked the car roughly where I thought, like within an hour's walk around here, probably that entrance should be from what I had read. And I went into vision and just worked with the spirits and said, look, now you just need to guide me, because it's going to be impossible for me to find this hole in the ground through which you slip into that underground cave. And I probably walked for 20 minutes, 15 minutes. I don't know. It was really short. And I stood right in front of it. It's so, I think as Westerners in particular, we are all at risk of making magic way too complicated. It is actually super straightforward. And once you're clicked into spirit contact, most often it's actually your complicated Western European mind that, keeps you from doing the magic. So that was a great example. And then ever since, I've been returning to that place very carefully, only when I really needed to, and have been working with the beings that live far down in that space and further down.
And I know, Frater, listeners, even of the sections you do have in the book, will really enjoy reading about your experiences there. I mean, just incredibly powerful. And one of those 3 tips that you also mentioned, Frater, is to embrace the direct otherness of the spirits face to face, you say, without, quote, any magical protective cushioning. Can you share with us what is some of this magical protective cushioning? Is it like, having all of those extra layers of rituals and complexity, or what does it mean when it comes to magical protective cushioning?
This is a big part of the misunderstanding, or maybe the problems with the traditional Goetic rituals. Some of the spirits that are mentioned in the original Goetic manuscripts, they actually might be dangerous to interact with. So when it comes to these, I would not recommend just walking up to them and saying, hey, this is me, and look, let's do something together. That might not be wise. The trick is then not to build up cushioning and protection and armor until you're ready to walk up to them. The trick is to begin with spirits who are actually living close by where you already are. Don't start with the most daring, difficult, complex work. Start with something that's really obvious and clean. And so for me to walk into this cave that is relatively close to where I live and just kind of talk to beings that are there, these beings are not particularly dangerous unless you threaten them. Imagine them like wolves or something. If you know how to deal with them, they're just wolves. They're not like particularly dangerous. So that would be my advice. Learn how to interact with spirits and respect them. I give you a practical example. I was walking my dog a couple of years ago, and I came across a beautiful plant hidden in the forest. And I sat down and meditated and went into a vision and looked for the spirit in that plant. And the spirit in that plant was super present. She was talking to me and was very friendly. And she totally encouraged me to dig her out and to bring this plant into my garden. And I was fascinated. Oh my God, this is like the most friendly plant spirit that I've met in a long time. I went home, was all excited about my project of bringing this plant into my garden. And then I did a couple of tarot readings, say, okay, well, let's just have a look. If I brought this plant into my garden, would that be good for the rest of the garden? Would that be good for me? And it turned out that it would have been terrible for me to bring that plant into my garden. Now, this is the moment normally where humans stop being open to otherness. So what I mean with that is that the spirit in this plant is not at all evil. The spirit in this plant has an agenda. It has a purpose. It has a desire. And I was very useful to this plant in becoming a host of this plant. My garden would have become a host of this parasitic plant in this case. And that's just what nature does. So if my decision would have been to bring it in, then, great for that plant, not so great for me, maybe, and the other plants. But there's no moral to it. There's no overlay of, oh, this is right and this is wrong. There's just desires. There's just agendas. There's just ways of being. And we need to learn to navigate them. That's what I mean with otherness. Stop judging things. Just listen and understand why people, spirits, do what they do. And that will reveal so much about yourself, so much about your interactions with them. And it will also reveal how you can be efficient in walking in all between them.
Absolutely beautiful advice and experiences. And what you do so well in the book that I absolutely love is you also touch on and trace out the broad strokes and connect the dots on very important figures in the history of magical practice that many people might not even know about. And one of those people is Johannes Bëer, the White Goes. Can you please share with us about Bëer's white kind of goetia and You say, quote, Bëer is a chthonic spirit worker of the empty hand.
So Johannes Bëer was a late 16th century, early 17th century figure, loosely related to the circles of Jacob Böhme later on. And he was a very active spirit worker, it seems. We have one book seemingly written by himself, which is a very magical book. And I quote sections of it in that chapter. He's predominantly forgotten today, I think. But one very eminent and important German anthropologist and magical researcher, Will Erich Peukert, he wrote about him. And he wrote about him in several of his books and called out that Johannes Bëer was a really, really important and overlooked figure in Western magic. And I'm trying to shine a light on the research that he and others had done at that time. The story is this. So Johannes Bëer, we're told, was a wandering guy in a very rural environment of Eastern Europe. And he was talking to spirits in nature. He was a wise man. There are many stories of people like him finding an axis, a gate, a cave, something that opens up into a mountain, and then walking into that mountain. And then, they find treasures in the mountain, and, they're all excited. And either they pick up as many of the treasure as they can and they run out. And then by the time that they're out, all that they have in their pockets is stones. Or maybe they run out and they want to come back with friends to loot the treasure, and then the gate is gone. So you find plenty of these stories of treasure hunting in the insides of caves or mountains. And his story begins similar to that. But then it turns and then it changes. And what happens is that Johannes Bëer encounters three spirits in the inside of a mountain. And these are very Goetic spirits related to the dead and to the underworld. And he's beginning to talk to these spirits, seemingly without any intent to create wealth or anything for himself. He just wants to interact with these spirits. And as he interacts with them, and he actually begins to talk to them about ethics and morals and free will, the spirits become increasingly uncomfortable and say, what is all this talking about having ethics and morals? Like we don't do that shit. Just kind of do normal stuff with us. The spirits offer Johannes Bëer a magical book. They put the magical book out like a Liber Spiritum, and they call it the Liber Obedientiae, which is the book of obedience. And they will stop just all this talk about us needing to level up ethically. Just take the freaking book and do what other magicians do. And he doesn't take the book. He does not accept that book. And he said, no, look, I don't need to control you. I want to have a conversation with you in how we together can become more ethical. And of course, this is the late 16th century. So his conversation is colored through a Christian lens, and he talks about some of the Christian concepts. But essentially, what he's trying to do is he's trying to infuse the best of what the human spirit has to offer, which is taking responsibility for your free will and, living with integrity and showing up with values that nobody forces you to hold on to except you yourself. And he's trying to teach these very chthonic nature spirits to do a little bit of that. And that is why Peukert and others have called him a white magician, because he's not operating driven out of an egocentric personal agenda. He's driven because he wants to be in touch with nature, and he kind of wants to create a cross-pollination or hybrid between what nature has to offer and what humans have to offer, and he wants to be in interaction with these spirits. So it's the most fascinating account, and it's also where the title of the book comes from, because this whole story ends then with him actually gaining a key to the underworld, Clavis, to the Goetic underworld. So definitely a topic that deserves more research and writing.
When it comes to that, Frater, to that exact point of shining a light on these historical figures and connecting the dots, you then focus on something that was absolutely fascinating for me, and I didn't realize how much I did not know. And that was where you dedicate a portion of the book to skull divination, or the teraphim. And you also present, I believe for the first time fully in English, a translation of the Ars Phaetonica. Why did you explore and tie in and connect the dots with skull divination? And what is the Ars Phaetonica?
Yeah, I'll keep that short, because I think this is something that I spend the majority of the book on really kind of analyzing and explaining. So I don't want to repeat all of that, but let's try to cut through to the essence of it. skulls are really practical magical objects, because skulls, and for us as human beings, the human skull, they're just amazing, powerful spirit vessels. And you need to imagine that as a very literal term. It is the shell or whatever kind of vessel that spirits very easily want to reside in and dwell in. Now, the trick, obviously, is that as a magician, you don't want to have any kind of spirit in it. You want to have a helpful spirit in it with whom you can interact. So the work of the magician ideally is in, of course, finding a skull, if that's how you want to work, purifying it, because there's probably stuff living in it and still attached to it. So first of all, you need to cleanse it. The act of magic then is, how do you attract a spirit to dwell in it voluntarily that is useful and helpful to the kind of work that you want to do? Imagine, we've all seen this in documentaries of the deep sea or so, and you have certain snails and other animals living in certain vessels. It's the same thing here. This is just an empty space that really it lends itself for spirits to live in. And how do you practice this with a certain kind of skill and craft? I came across this through the research that we were doing in translating many of the documents from the Leipzig collection of grimoires. And I've published a few of these on holydiamond.com. Most of these are all about angelic magic. And then we came across the Ars Photonica, which definitely is not about angelic magic. It's much more chthonic, much darker. It's a very short text, actually presented in two different versions, which is fascinating because it speaks to the fact that there is no orthopraxy. There's no one right way of doing this, but we need to experiment with these things. And so it was super valuable for me to spend the time going as deep as I possibly could and trying to understand, what is this text trying to teach me? What is it that I can learn from it? To pierce through the surface of that text and understand the practice and the history behind it, which then took us to the teraphim, which is an old practice in the Jewish culture. But all of this ultimately led to me beginning to work with human skulls in my own magical practice. And so basically what you're reading there is my own preparation for beginning this work myself.
Frater, to that point, could you elaborate on this beautiful conclusion that you have where you say, quote, "Instead of solely focusing on reading as the pivotal skill of the magician, the Ars Photonica reminds us of the importance of actively listening."
Well, that's, I think, down to the whole essence of it. The essence of it is, how do you prepare a skull that speaks to you? And obviously, it's not the skull that speaks to you, but it's a spirit that resides within the skull with whom you interact. Of course, it takes a lot of skill to do this in a way that's functional. To attract a spirit into a skull is actually very, very simple. Quite the opposite. I think any human remains, in particular skulls that you keep in your home, it's rather difficult not to have any spirit in it after a while. So the real task for the magician is not how do you enliven the skull, but how do you learn to interact with it? How do you learn to speak and listen and really be in touch with it? In my own practice, I've been experimenting with these skulls, and I realize physical proximity is, of course, important. Physical touch is important. But once that connection is established, they begin talking to you like at all sorts of moments in time. So it's fascinating, but the trick is not necessarily in any kind of conjuration, how you kind of wield your sword or dagger. That's not really the trick. The trick is, how do you understand when they're talking to you, when they're not talking to you? How do you differentiate thoughts that pop into your mind and the origin of these thoughts? And then going further, how do you begin to have dialogue with these beings that doesn't disturb your own mental processes and that lead to something? Like, why are you doing this work? Where are you going with this? Of course, there's an aspect of just joyful experimentation and proving to yourself that this works, which is, of course, very human. We want to find things out. But at the end of the day, it is, how are you going to work in service, in benefit of these spirits that are in the skull? And in return, how are you going to make sure that they will not just exploit you as a host, but that they also work with respect to your humanness?
We've had several magicians and scryers on the program before, and they mentioned that when they are engaging with spirits, sometimes it's very subtle, where they might have to kind of parse out and separate, this is not my thought I'm having right now. This is something from a spirit. Other times there might be more of an audible impression that is given. When you are engaging, Frater, with the spirits dwelling in the skulls, is that something where you audibly can hear it? Is it something that kind of seems to be originating as a completely independent thought in your own head? Do you journal these things down? Anything you can share about the process, I think people might find really fascinating.
Yeah, this is where I think you cannot make generalized statements. Just like a human's immune system is unique like their fingerprint, so also your way of interacting with the spirits would be not entirely, there would probably be other people who experience it in the same way, but there's a huge range in how you might experience this. So for me, I do not hear anything audible, nothing at all, nothing that, another person would realize, or even if I was untrained, if I was untrained, I wouldn't even realize that this is actually magic. This is like beings talking to you. Now, going back to the beginning of our conversation, we talked about the fact that it took me about 2 to 3 years with Imbolc and Agrippa to even begin doing ritual magic. This is part of the reason why it took so long. It took me the better part of 2 years to just shut up my own thoughts, to just create silence in my own brain. And that to me is an absolute prerequisite to work with spirits, because if you don't shut up your own chatter, you will not be able to distinguish their chatter from it. So that backbone is essentially helpful. Now, the way this works for me is that when I create contact with a new spirit, I do that in a very deliberate mental state where I can tune out most of my own thoughts. It's a very empty, silent space. And then I invite them in and we can talk, and I, hear kind of what they're telling me in my mind, and I can respond back. And it's a very active relationship. Obviously, it transcends words. Like many spirits just don't like words. They don't want to communicate in words. They have other ways of communicating to you. So you might have a dream. A lot of them click into your hormonal system. So you would then experience it to fluctuations in that. So of course, as a human, it's the easiest to do it in words, but not necessarily the easiest for the spirits. Once that contact is established, I can put myself into a state of, again, tuning out my own thoughts, words, etc., and invite them in. And it's purely only an act of inviting them in, and they begin talking again. I can stand on a playground, killing time for as long as my daughter is playing, and I can click into them and we begin to talk. Or I can go for a run, and while I'm on the run is actually wonderful because it tunes out a lot of, the noise that comes from your body. You can click in and you begin to talk. Now, for me, one of the things that is really helpful in differentiating whether I'm telling myself a story, and this is just wishful thinking on my end, or whether this is a spirit's voice, is most of the interactions that I'm having with spirits, whatever I'm hearing from them, whatever they're teaching me, is deeply surprising to me. It is not stuff that I would have thought of whatsoever. So that is generally a very good, I think, differentiator. Think of words as if they had a scent. And when these words come into your minds, they just smell differently. You can smell and taste that, oh man, hang on, this is different. Where did that just come from? This is not from me. Like, this is disrupting my normal thought patterns. Very often also they just disagree with me and redirect me. So I began writing these poems a couple of months ago, and I found this to be a hugely effective way of communicating with my skulls, because, the way you kind of bring a poem down on paper, at least for me, is in becoming very silent and quiet and just allowing the words to come through. And so as I'm writing these poems down in a raw format, often I don't even know what they mean. I just allow it to happen. I'm just the medium. It just comes out.
Is it something about the poem itself, Frater, when you're writing your own poems, something about the structure or the compression, or dare I even say the kind of encrypted language that might be there, kind of a poem acting as kind of a sigilized language to help be more conductive to engaging with spirits or recording their thoughts, or anything you can share about writing poems and the importance of that?
Well, I'd encourage everybody to just explore this for themselves. My 2 cents right now would be that the actual poem that comes out is rather meaningless. The poem actually isn't that important. What is important is the moment of contact. In the moment of receiving these words and allowing these spirits to take over in your mind, that's where something happens. I had moments where I wrote really terrible poems, but I felt the most grateful for this contact and for what I think was actually just the spirit's presence in my body, in my mind. And that present was just so beautiful. The fact that I couldn't capture this into perfectly polished words, it doesn't matter. Like I'm not very fond of the poems. I'm very fond of the process that initiates them.
One of the listener questions we have, speaking of skulls and skull divination, is from Trace Henry. And Trace is asking, Frater, beyond talking to skulls, what other forms of divination do you use regularly in your practice?
Two answers to this. Mainly, I use tarot and just do the cards. I work a lot with just normal tarot cards for things that are a bit more practical, everyday related. And then with the deck that Josephine McCarthy published through Korea, which is a much more magical deck and much, much easier to use and more tuned if you have magical questions. But overall, I try to do as little divination as possible. And that goes back to a premise that I just have deeply established for myself many years ago, that real life is for real life tools. I try to get along with my life with using as little magic as I can. So I try to tackle practical problems with practical skills, and magic would be my last resort if I needed to. That in return allows me to keep my magical projects focused on stuff where I don't have a need. When I do magic, I try to do magic that's not about me. I try to be able to show up to work as part of an ecosystem. So as a ripple effect of that, I try to use divination, tarot, or dream incubation as little as I can. It's a cry for help in moments when I need it, and I want it to be clear as that.
We have a listener question from Nusha, who is also asking, what advice, Frater, would you give to help in integrating magic with mundane life or mundane career situations? And I know that you said that, you try and keep them separate, but is there ever any cross-pollination or is there ever any crossover regarding that?
Let me explain that, because I'm not trying to keep them separate. So the integration is already there. You're just not seeing it. It's impossible for you to do a magical ritual, a magical act, and for this act not to have ramifications into your everyday life. Of course, if it's a minor act, maybe that might happen, but I'm speaking of more meaningful magic. Any thorough magical act that I've ever been part of had significant ripple effects on my life. So that integration is already there. You're just not seeing it. So don't worry about these mechanics. They will happen anyway. What you can do about this, what is kind of your job as a human being, is to be entirely focused on becoming the best possible magician that you can imagine, just as much as the best possible professional in whatever profession you've chosen, just as much as the best possible spouse, partner, father, mother, whatever you have. Don't worry that you become a magical spouse or a magical father. Like, all of this will happen on the back end. Just concentrate and be clear for yourself. Have a clear vision. Who am I striving to become as a professional? Who am I striving to become as a magician, etc.? You do not need one answer for this. You can have very different answers for that, and that is perfectly fine. The integration already exists on the back end of life.
That actually leads, Frater, to another listener question from Nusha, who is asking, what advice, Frater, would you give to a burnt magician to help rise up again?
That happened to me as well. It's very hard to give an answer to that because it kind of depends on the specifics of the situation. I guess in general terms, I'd say, if you've been badly burned, whatever that is, physical side effects, psychological side effects, effects in your life that you attribute back to the magic that you've been doing, I definitely would say stay abstinent for a longer period. Just don't do magic for a longer period. Of course, the magic will be there on the back end. You can't stop it. It's always there. But don't mess with it. Like, don't get your fingers into the wheel. Just let it spin for a while. and try to take control of your physical life. Try to enjoy life to the fullest without being in the circle of the art, without doing magic. Enjoy your friends, enjoy sunlight, enjoy good food. And then the second advice that I would have for anybody who got burned is make sure you have a tribe of trusted people around you who you can go to and have a conversation about. I think this is a bit of a misperception maybe when I call myself a lone practitioner or a practitioner of the solitary path. I do not feel alone whatsoever on my path. I have many great friends in the magical realm that I'll ask advice for constantly. But when I do my magic, that's when I'm alone. I would say these two things. Stay abstinent, go on a good magical land for a couple of months, if not years. Be mindful that just because you're not holding a sword or a dagger or something, the magic is always present. It's always there on the back end. So you don't need to push yourself to experience it. And then enjoy just company of great people, good food, enjoy the simple things in life.
Frater, we also have a listener question from Sasha Olivier Dulac, who is asking, I would like to know more about Frater's work with the Olympic spirits and if and how this influenced Frater's Goetic practice. What kind of impact did conjuring the Olympic spirits have on Frater's life and your relationship with the unseen, Frater?
Yeah, they had a totally pivotal impact on me. When I left Imbolc in 2011, that's when I started the work on the Arbatel. That was one of my main pieces of work afterwards. And ever since, so for the last 10 years in particular, they had significant impact on me. There's a misunderstanding of what these spirits are. And in the third volume of the Holy Diamond Cycle, Holy Heretics, which will come out later this year with Scarlet Imprint, I'm speaking about this at length. This book will have two parts, and the second part is entirely dedicated to the Olympic spirits. At the end of that book, I'm presenting what I would call a restored rite of the Olympic spirits that hopefully will clarify a lot of how, in my opinion, they were meant to be worked with. When I finished writing that book, I initially thought, oh, well, that's great. Like that chapter's over. Finally, I did that work and I'm good with it. And now I'm back to writing and working on the Olympic spirits again. So they clearly still seem to want me to engage more and write a little bit more. And so I'm doing this right now. But the question that listener asked, it could easily be misunderstood. When you connect to spirits like the Olympic spirits, or the Olympic spirit, because it could also be just one, but we'll speak about this in Holy Heretics. They become part of who you are. They become like you're weaving yourself into them and vice versa. Not that you're not woven into them anyway, but you're waking up that weave. So there's no way that they could not influence what you're doing from then onwards, not only in magic, but when you go and buy your groceries, when you wash your car, whatever you might do, like these become a fabric. Now a talking, a speaking fabric of who you are. So like you don't need to do Olympic spirit ritual to then do a ritual of another nature. That's not how it works. A lot of these rites you only need to do once in your life to click into the relationship with that spirit.
Speaking of that, Frater, we have a listener question from Tully who's asking, I'd like to thank Frater Acker for his inspirational work, especially for Holy Daimon, which has clarified so much for me. And Tully is asking, given Frater Acker's strong affinity with Rosicrucianism as a living tradition, and the fact that Frater has now written a book with a clear shamanic Goetic focus inspired by Jake Stratton Kent's work, Tully's saying, I'd like to ask whether, Frater, you see a real difference or conflict between these approaches to the study and practice of magic in 2021. I'd therefore be interested to know whether Frater Acker considers his work as a synthesis of sorts, whether Frater sees a real ideological or magical divergence here, or merely one of emphasis. And does Frater have any related advice?
Yeah, that's a lot of questions in one. I would suggest, Alex, maybe we do another session on the Rosicrucian magic book and just go into more depth there later on. But to answer this as succinctly as I can, I would point out what I said earlier. If you look through the lens of the spirits, spirits don't do Rosicrucian magic, spirits don't do Goetia, spirits don't do Solomonic. That, like all of these are human words. Now, these human words, they're important because they're our history, they're our past, and how our ancestors and others have worked with these spirits. And they're a gold mine sometimes to learn and not to do foolish mistakes in how we can maintain that living interaction, that bond with the spirits, and continue to practice it. So I'm taking two very different access routes here, the Clavis Goêtica book and then the Rosicrucian magic book, but they lead to the same thing. They lead to the same kind of interaction with the spirits. Maybe the essential difference in these two books is that the Clavis book is really about spirits around you. That's really about spirits who are very different from who you are as a human being. Spirits that live in the depth, in graves, in caves. The Rosicrucian magic book focuses on the spirit that is a human being. It focuses on you and how you might need to show up, might need to refine yourself so that there can be fruitful interactions between you and the other spirits.
And in terms of refining yourself and kind of taking yourself to that place, I know something, Frater, that you've written extensively about and people associate you with a lot, obviously, when it comes to the Holy Diamond, but also, of course, a very common term we hear is HGA, the Holy Guardian Angel. And we have a listener question to that point from Sedger. And Sedger is asking, to me, it seems that the concept of the Holy Guardian Angel has its origins to the tutelary spirits of the shamanic traditions. Frater Acker does a historical expose of the diamond and talks about techniques to attain conversation with your own HGA, techniques that include isolation and singing, very common shamanic practices when it comes to spirit communication. So Sedger is asking, does Frater Acker disregard the shamanic link because he's working within a Western ceremonial tradition or standard context boundaries we all draw? Or do you, Frater, believe that the HGA is totally unrelated to the tutelary spirits?
Well, that's a complicated question. And I would say I have no clue what my holy diamond really is. I cannot explain to you where this thing is coming from, how it's constructed, who constructed it, whether it was born, whether it was not born. I know how it interacts with myself. I know how it interacts with the stars and the worlds. I've learned a lot from it, but it's a very foreign being to me. I know it's way older than I am, but I want to speak from a practical point of view, Alex. I want to speak from a point of view of my own firsthand experience. So that listener is asking me, okay, have I gone into spirit contact and compared tutelary spirits, familiar spirits, and my holy diamond? No, I've not done that work to a depth and degree that I could give you an answer that I'm satisfied with from a practitioner's point of view. From a theoretical point of view, from an anthropological point of view, I think this is an exciting question, but it would require a lot of research because, again, a lot of what we have today available as books is people in the late Middle Ages traveling around, trying to describe stuff that they didn't really understand. And oftentimes, as I said, we learn more about the people who are trying to portray this otherness to us than the actual otherness. So it's a great question. And I think a theoretical answer would be interesting, but requires much research. A practical question would be way more interesting, but it would require a lifetime of experience in researching this further.
Frater, you've also brought up many times Imbolc, and we do have a listener question for you from Anonymous, who is saying, quote, I remember you, Frater, saying somewhere that you learned visionary magic mostly through Josephine McCarthy's Magical Knowledge series. I was wondering how much visionary magical training did you receive in Imbolc? And when you did ritual magic to contact spirits, how strong was the contact? And how does that compare to the strength of contact you feel when trying to contact spirits after learning visionary magic from Josephine's book?
So again, multiple questions here. The intensity of the contact definitely was the same. There's no difference. Whether I do a classical magical ritual where I draw spirits into whatever triangles or presence, or whether I just sit down and go to where the spirits live, the intensity of the contact always is the same. The intensity of the contact, I think, is so intense and so alive that it's very dangerous to become addicted on it. To me, the moments when I work in spirit, in contact with other spirits, they're probably certainly they are amongst the best moments in my entire life. And it's important, therefore, not to get addicted to them. As human beings, we're not meant to spend time in that space, whether it is through ritual evocation or visionary work every Friday afternoon. That's not how it's meant to work. So just because it's great, it doesn't mean you should have access to that level of greatness all the time. It's a little bit like with sex, it's great, but it also is great if you know how to bring it into a rhythm.
Frater, too, we do have a listener question for you from Douglas of What Magic Is This? And Douglas is asking, I'm just wondering about Frater Acker's thoughts on Liber Ophicorum Spiritum. Did it actually exist? And what are the chances of us finding a pre-Trithemius copy of it? And if it does exist, where did it come from?
This is a great question. In my mind, I have an anthropologist wanting to answer, and then, or maybe I'm not much of a historian, so an anthropologist. And then on the other side, I have a magician who also wants to give an answer. So from an anthropological point of view or historic point of view, I would definitely hope that we find a copy of that. There's so much that is still unpublished, it's really the tip of the iceberg that has come into publication when it comes to magical source works only. So I'd be very surprised if we didn't find a copy or multiple copies of it, probably with significant diversion and variance. Now, the magician would say, well, and then so what? Like the idea that you can publish a hierarchy of spirits and kind of map out that topology and territory of spirits. Well, what's that going to be good for unless you travel to that land and you experience it yourself? It would probably equip you with a little bit of a map, but many of these spirits' names, they're individual keys given between a magician and the spirit. Same is true for spirit sigils. Then if you go to some of these mother spirits, they can cut out children's spirits of themselves at any moment in time to whatever kind of purpose. So this is a living architecture. It's not stable. It is evolving all the time. So if somebody in, let's say, 1480 was mature enough as a magician to get a clear, sharp look at how these spirit offices and hierarchies work, and then they penned this all down, how relevant will this be to your work today? I think it's fascinating. I love it because I love historic research and I love anthropological kind of analysis of what this means for us today. But in my practical work, I'm not sure it's going to make a big difference.
We do also have a question about an often discussed topic from Trace Henry, who is asking, can you share, Frater, more about your work with the Greco-Egyptian magical papyri, the PGM, and the role that it plays or played in your personal practice? In a previous Glitch Bottle interview, Josephine McCarthy described the PGM as the bottom of the barrel of Egyptian magic. So what are your thoughts, Frater?
I love Josephine, and when she can be so beautiful, polemic about these things. So you just said something really important. I think it's fair to say that the PGMs are the bottom of the barrel of Egyptian magic. If you want authentic, original Egyptian magic, you definitely should not work with the PGMs. I totally agree to that, because they come from a much later age and time when what I would consider ancient Egyptian magic had either gone away, diluted, been forgotten, etc. However, from my point of view and my experience, I would not at all consider the PGM the bottom of the barrel of good magical source books whatsoever. I own multiple copies of them, the German, the English translation, and I found them hugely inspirational, hugely informative. I've used some of the hymns and invocations there to write my own hymns and invocation. I love the way they bring together all these traditions into very practical pieces of work. I love the diversity of spirit work that we find encapsulated in there. So I've benefited greatly from these works and continue to benefit from them greatly. What they do not have, and I think that is what Josephine alluded to, is they do not have a coherent mythological backbone. They're not created or crafted to express a coherent worldview that has ontological reality. They're scattered. They're kind of pamphlets of magic. They're a ritual here, a ritual there, and then brought together. But that doesn't mean that they can't have great value for your practice.
And that ties in when it comes to being flexible and kind of finding things that work for you in your own idiosyncratic way. We do have a listener question, Frater, for you from Sedger, who says, Frater mentions orthopraxy, which is interesting. To me, it seems that many modern ceremonial magicians and grimoires that we hear talk emphasize orthopraxy in a reificated or reified way, God's laws and stone tablets, and, oh, you must not change anything with regards to its practice. Even though we all know that history and magic is a constant flow and one technique is transformed and transferred and it's all a creative process, which this reified orthopraxy seems to kill in no small words. So Sedger's asking, Frater, what are your views on change and creativity contra orthopraxy as defined in a grimoire, for example?
Yeah, it's a good question. And maybe just for listeners who are not familiar with the term, just to give a definition of orthopraxy, it basically means that there's one right way of doing things. This is the way things need to be done. And it's a term that was very important in ancient Greek and ancient Egyptian ways, where they were much less concerned about orthodoxy. They didn't really care about what you believe because, working with spirits was not a matter of belief to them. Spirits were very real. So whatever you believed, that was yours. What mattered is what did you do? How did you behave? How did you conduct a certain ritual? So yeah, I mean, that has two sides to it, I would say. Again, I'll use an example from anthropology. In intercultural training in the late 80s, when people began to, commercially travel across continents and trade really began to pick up on a global scale, there were lots of training manuals for Europeans to go to, let's say Japan. And then you had these do's and don't lists, like, oh yes, when you're in Japan, never do this and always do that. Now, was there some element of truth to these do's and don't lists? Absolutely, there was, like people had written these who had made firsthand experience as Europeans with Japanese culture, and this was an artifact that they had produced. But the reality is that the Japanese culture is something that's alive. And you might encounter a Japanese millennial who's much more alike to a British millennial or a US millennial than they are actually alike to a conservative old Japanese woman or man. So the same is true for spirit work in orthopraxy. There's some rules that are probably really reasonable and they make a lot of sense and it's really good to adhere to them. And then there's a lot of rubbish that people wrote about spirit cultures that have evolved, that have gone away, or maybe rules that make more of a statement about themselves than the spirit world. Unfortunately, we can't get around the very hard and difficult work. It's the work of a lifetime for you as a magician to figure this out for yourself.
That's really one of the themes that I think you're touching on over and over again, Frater, is even with years of experience as you have, it is so important to remember that there is always this bathing in strangeness. There's this embracing of the other. And is it fair to say that, and we've had some previous guests mention this too, that if you enter a magical ritual for a contact with a spirit and it goes exactly as you thought it would go, there's no surprises, everything kind of happens as you've expected it, and there's no strangeness or no otherness, then you might not be doing it quite correctly. Would that be somewhat fair, or at least that there is usually this sincere experience of strangeness in every interaction?
Yes, that is very true. I don't think any of my magical rituals have gone according to plan. And that is probably because I normally only do a very rough outline for them. I don't plan everything in detail because I know, well, at the end of the day, this will be two of us. This will be me, and then there will be the spirit or the spirits. And how could I possibly script what's going to happen once they or he or she arrives and will interact? I probably script how I will get into it. I'll script how I'll get out of it. And then there is a big middle section that remains to be explored. But let me just emphasize maybe one connection here as well, which is a dangerous one because it's a correlation to psychology. In psychology, there is much conversation about how do you get to a stage where you can live your life without expectations. So when you go on your grocery shopping or when you go to the cinema or when you meet friends, how can you be truly present to that experience and not numb it and crash it with expectations of how you now expect yourself to show up, them to show up, and then something doesn't go according to plan and you're all disappointed. Like the most beautiful, vibrant, alive way of experiencing our lives is by just being present and then allowing things to happen, but having very clear standards, backbones of ethics, morals that will allow you to then navigate the unexpected. And I would say that to me translates totally into my magical practice. I want to be present. I don't want things to be scripted or coerced. And then I'm anchored into my ethics. I'm anchored into my foundational skills that I've worked hard on gaining. Oftentimes they don't suffice and I got myself into trouble. But that would be maybe a metaphor, or you can use this psychological idea to transpose that into magical practice.
Frater, many listeners, and I think many people who might practice magic, tend to fall into certain psychological traps, as you say. On the one hand, there might be people who have a lust for results. So they just want something to happen so bad, they want an experience, and then they get anxious because nothing's happening and there's no sign. But on the other side of the spectrum, you have people who are so convinced that they're going to automatically fail that they just will garble through the invocations and maybe nothing will happen. So because you really stress, hey, you have to stay in the moment, you have to be present. What are some tips you might have for avoiding those mental pitfalls and staying in the moment?
Well, this goes back again to the work that I did at Imbo 2 years, 3 years before I actually started to do any rituals. Psychology has nothing to do with magic. Magic and the magical realm exists entirely independent of human beings. The only factor that brings in psychology is the human being. Now, psychology has a lot to do with magic because if you as a human being want to interact with magic, you always also bring psychology. And especially, as I said earlier, a lot of the magical rituals, contexts that we experience, they will have a massive effect, a ripple effect into your entire life. And your entire life, you as a human being experience through a lens of psychology. So they're interwoven, but they're actually quite different. My personal 2 cents would be, do not do magic until you've become really comfortable in your own skin. And I don't mean that in a cocky way, in a full of yourself way, but in a humble way. And that's where I think, for me, my training that I did outside of my magical training on the coaching side, on the Gestalt therapy side, that has helped me as a human being greatly to know who I am, to know my fabric, to know kind of my vulnerabilities and to be comfortable with them. I'm very flawed as a human being, but I'm probably good enough to do this or that. And, my flaws won't get in the way of that. So I'd say totally you need to engage with psychology to become ready to do magic that then has nothing to do with psychology.
Frater, to that point, we have a listener question for you from Salem. And Salem is asking and saying many thanks to Frater Acker for the incredible work you're doing and releasing. And Salem asks, putting individuality aside for the moment, what do you believe are the 3 most important pursuits to strengthen a magician's practice? And further, what are the top pitfalls to be avoided? Again, for each of us, this is surely somewhat different, but Salem says, for example, it's well known that meditation is paramount.
If I think about 3 things, I would give Salem the following 3. I think the first one as prerequisites to thorough magical practice to me is to sit in silence and unmoved for probably at least an hour. I don't care whether you call that meditation or whatever. When I learned this actually had nothing to do with meditation. It was very, very painful just getting me to a place where I could sit silent for an hour. I didn't get anything to do with my mind. It was just shut up and sit there. But this practice teaches your body that sitting silent for an hour does not mean it's going to die. Because your body is a spirit, it's a being in itself, and your body wants to move. It either wants to be asleep or it wants to move around. And so when you sit down and you shut up, normally what you have an itching here and you have a pain there because your body just really doesn't like these shackles. It doesn't like to be confined. So to be able to sit down for an hour and just be silent is a prerequisite, as I explained, I think earlier in our conversation, in order to listen. The second point that I would give Salem is overcoming our desire to judge. The moment you come out of a ritual, or even when you're in it, your mind is trying to tell yourself a story. It's trying to knit together different experiences, weird things, otherness, unexplainable stuff that just happened. And it's trying to categorize it, judge it, overlay a filter of good and bad, right and wrong. Being able to hold yourself in a space where you do not see the story yet. You just have the different pieces, but you're becoming very clear of what these pieces are. That's what it takes to experience otherness. That's what a good anthropologist does. Before they're beginning to tell themselves a story, they just lay out all the facts, unclouded by their own bias, as much as possible, of course. And then the third thing I would give Salem is really just discipline. Like with any other art and craft, magic will be eternally a hobby unless you can break through the moments that you can only get through with discipline. So just like in any other profession, any other work, there will be moments where this work sucks. And will you hold on or will you let it go? If you really, I think, want to create a life that's filled with magic, you need a good amount of discipline without becoming overly rigid. So prepare yourself for a very, very long journey.
Those are absolutely wonderful tips. And I know myself, and I really hope the listeners are certainly taking notes. Can you share with us, Frater, about where people can find you online, any information? And of course, we'll make sure to link to it below, and also where they can order their copy of the Clavis Goetia.
Yeah, so you mentioned it in the intro, theomagica.com or theomagica.com is kind of my main place, my kind of working space, if you want, online. We founded paralibrum.com, which is a really fun project where we're publishing occult book reviews that I've been just totally humbled and amazed by the great quality of contributors and participants that we found over the last year. And then I have holydiamond.com, which is really a place where I share very specifically related material, original source texts that were begun to translate that really kind of read through and lens of angelic magic. And then with regards to buying the books, the Clavis Goetica books is best purchased through Hadean Press directly, but you can buy your softcover copy equally on Amazon and elsewhere. We're in the process of preparing a second batch of the hardcover prints, so do not despair if you wanted one of these. They will be back in stock. Yeah, that's it.
Well, that is wonderful. And I definitely encourage you listeners to check out your own copy of the Clavis Goetica. It's absolutely fantastic. And can you share with us just about your future works, your research, your projects, anything else that we have not touched on yet?
I'm doing this piece of work on the Olympic spirits right now, which is, as so often in kind of research work or also magical work, I thought this is going to be about a week's amount of work. And now I've been on it for several months because it kind of proved to be a barrel without a bottom. So I'll see where that goes and how I kind of wrap this up whenever it's ready. But this is exciting work because I continue to be deeply excited about the Olympic spirits and their practical impact on magic and people's lives. So I'm working on this. And then I'm in the early stages of gathering material and writing elements for a bigger book, a more kind of significant book that will probably be in the making for the next 2 years or so, and will relate back a lot to the Kabbalistic work that I've done, the work with the Sephiro, some reflections on the Klippot, etc. But that's too early kind of to go into detail.
Author, magician, practitioner, and just overall very generous person, Frater Åker, stopping by the podcast to chat about Clavis Goetica, the keys to chthonic sorcery. Frater Åker, thank you so much for just taking the time and coming on the podcast today.
Thank you. It was a pleasure. Thank you.
Listeners, what wisdom, what needed reminders, and fascinating explorations with Frater Åker. I hope you enjoyed that as much as I did. I mean, how many times, myself included, do we refuse to allow our minds to become still? How many times do we prefer to tell ourselves a story about how awesome or amazing or clever or in tune with spirits we are when we never even put in the requisite physical and mental training to even begin to walk the path effectively? How many times do we consider spirits as an auxiliary support to human life instead of what they are, a massive, strange, and unspoken part of the fabric of reality which we barely understand? I am so thankful for Frater Åker's research, his wisdom, and the context he puts both the Goetic tradition and magical ritual in. And thanks to each and every Glitch Bottle patron on Patreon for your support and your questions, which as usual were so excellent and added so much to the conversation. And if you'd like to support Glitch Bottle and get exclusive perks, please consider hopping on the Glitch Bottle caravan at patreon.com/glitchbottle. And as always, you can subscribe to Glitch Bottle on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Spreaker.com, and Stitcher Radio. As always, this is Alexander Eth reminding you to invoke often, uncork the uncommon, and keep the light.